Picture a sky so thick with aircraft that the sun vanished. Picture German fighter pilots climbing into their cockpits for what they believed would be another hunt, only to find themselves the hunted. Picture an entire air force, the pride of the Third Reich, systematically erased from existence in 7 days. This was not gradual attrition or strategic withdrawal. This was annihilation on a scale that defied comprehension. In February 1944, over 1,000 American B-17 flying fortresses launched what historians would call Big Week, and in those 7 days of relentless thunder, the Luftwaffe bled out across German skies. The question that haunted Berlin was not how it happened, but how they never saw it coming. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The winter of 1944 hung over Europe like a shroud of frozen despair. For nearly 5 years the continent had burned under the boot of Nazi conquest, and now the tide was turning, but slowly, agonizingly slow. The Allied invasion of France loomed on the horizon, a date circled in blood on every calendar in Washington and London. But there was a problem that kept generals awake at night, a problem that could drown Operation Overlord before a single soldier touched Normandy sand. The Luftwaffe still ruled the skies over Germany. Hermann Göring's Air Force remained a lethal predator, capable of shredding bomber formations and turning invasion fleets into floating coffins. Every intelligence report hammered home the same brutal truth: without air superiority, D-Day would become the greatest massacre in military history. Deep inside the Pentagon's labyrinthine corridors, a plan took shape that would either break the Luftwaffe's spine or cost the 8th Air Force everything it had built. They called it Operation Argument, but the men who would fly it had a simpler name: Big Week. The concept was audacious to the point of madness. Instead of scattered raids and cautious probing, the Americans would unleash every bomber they possessed in a sustained hammer blow against the heart of German aircraft production. For 7 consecutive days, weather permitting, over 1,000 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators would darken German skies, striking factories, assembly plants, and airfields with such ferocity that the Luftwaffe would have no choice but to rise and defend. And when they rose, American escort fighters would be waiting to destroy them. The gamble was absolute. If the weather turned, if coordination failed, if the Luftwaffe proved stronger than estimated, the 8th Air Force could be gutted, leaving Britain defenseless and Overlord impossible. But if it succeeded, if those 7 days of fury could bleed the Luftwaffe white, then the road to Berlin would lie open. General Karl Spaatz, commander of United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, stared at weather maps with the intensity of a man betting his entire career on a roll of dice. He needed clear skies over Germany, a rare gift in February's perpetual gloom. For weeks, clouds had smothered the continent, grounding bombers and granting the Luftwaffe precious time to rebuild from earlier losses. But meteorologists detected a shift, a high-pressure system moving across the Atlantic that promised a brief window of crystalline visibility. Spaatz gave the order. February 20th would mark the beginning. Big Week would commence. At air bases scattered across the English countryside, ground crews worked through the night with frantic purpose. Bomb bays were loaded with 1,000-pounders, incendiaries stacked like cordwood in aluminum bellies. Mechanics crawled over engines, checking every cylinder, every spark plug, knowing that a single failure at 20,000 feet could doom 10 men. Armorers fed belts of 50-caliber ammunition into machine guns mounted in every position: nose, tail, waist, ball turret, top turret. Each B-17 bristled with defensive fire, earning its nickname Flying Fortress. But every crew knew the truth. Those guns might keep some fighters at bay, but against determined Luftwaffe aces, survival was lottery. Among the thousands of young men preparing for the coming storm was Captain Michael Torrance, a pilot from Oklahoma, whose boyish face and easy smile masked the hard edge of a man who had already survived 12 missions over occupied Europe. Torrance flew a B-17G named Wrath of Angels, a machine scarred by flak and patched so many times the ground crew joked it was more rivets than aluminum. His crew trusted him with the fierce loyalty born from shared terror. They had seen aircraft beside them disintegrate in mid-air, watched parachutes blossom and fail, heard the screams over intercom as finding them trapped in metal coffins. Yet they climbed back into Wrath of Angels every time, because Torrance had a gift for bringing them home. On the evening of February 19th, Torrance sat in the officers' mess, nursing weak coffee and studying reconnaissance photographs of their primary target, Tuto, a sprawling aircraft factory near the Baltic coast responsible for producing Focke-Wulf fighters. The images showed massive assembly halls, rail yards choked with freight cars, barracks housing thousands of workers. Intelligence estimated the factory could produce 60 fighters per month, 60 Luftwaffe Predators, that would soon prowl the skies over France when invasion came. The mission briefing had been blunt: destroy Tuto, and the Luftwaffe loses a vital artery. Fail, and those 60 fighters would feast on Allied troops struggling to establish beachheads. Beside him sat Lieutenant Frank Holloway, his navigator, a former school teacher from Vermont, whose mind held maps the way other men held memories. Holloway traced routes on the photographs with a steady finger, calculating distances, timing, expected flak concentrations. Every mission was a mathematical puzzle where one wrong calculation meant death. The route to Tuto would take them deep into Germany, beyond the range of most escort fighters, leaving the bombers naked before Luftwaffe interceptors for critical minutes. Those minutes would determine who lived and who became statistics in a casualty report. Across the table, Sergeant Eddie Kowalski, the ball turret gunner, cleaned his glasses with meticulous care. Kowalski was barely 20, a kid from Chicago who should have been worrying about baseball scores and Saturday night dates, not crouching in a plexiglass bubble beneath a bomber while German fighters tried to set him on fire. The ball turret was the loneliest, most vulnerable position on the aircraft, a sphere of glass and steel suspended below the fuselage, where a gunner could track enemy fighters attacking from below. It was also a death trap. If landing gear failed, the ball turret gunner would be crushed on landing. If the aircraft went down and the turret mechanism jammed, escape was impossible. Kowalski never spoke about those possibilities. He just cleaned his glasses and climbed into his bubble every mission with the resigned acceptance of a man who had made peace with fate. The briefing room filled near midnight, rows of young faces illuminated by harsh overhead lights. Most were barely old enough to vote: farm boys and factory workers, college students and garage mechanics, united by circumstance and the shared knowledge that morning might be their last. The intelligence officer, Major Donald Prescott, mounted the stage and pulled back the curtain covering the wall map. A collective intake of breath filled the room as the red ribbon stretched from England across the North Sea deep into the German heartland. Tuto, over 500 miles of enemy territory. 6 hours in the air, half a dozen flak belts to penetrate.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
And the Luftwaffe, always the Luftwaffe, rising like wasps from a kick nest. Prescott's voice carried the practiced calm of a man who would not be flying the mission he described. Expected enemy resistance, heavy flak concentrations, severe fighter opposition, intense. The words were euphemisms, corporate speak for hell. He clicked through slides showing the target from multiple angles, pointing out aiming points, alternate targets if weather obscured the primary. Then came the section every crew dreaded: losses. Statistical probability suggested 10% would not return. In a formation of 100 bombers, 10 aircraft would be blown from the sky, 100 men dead, wounded, or captured. The odds were better than earlier in the war, Prescott assured them, thanks to improved tactics and increasing fighter escort. The reassurance rang hollow. Dead was dead, whether statistics favored you or not. When Prescott finished, the crews filed out into the bitter February night. Torrance walked slowly, savoring the cold air, the smell of wet grass and distant sea. In a few hours, he would be encased in heated flight gear, breathing oxygen through a mask, hands frozen despite gloves, watching condensation trails from 1,000 bombers etch white scars across blue sky. But now, in the darkness before dawn, England felt almost peaceful. Almost. The illusion shattered when air raid sirens wailed across the base. German bombers, probing British defenses, dropping their loads on cities already scarred by years of blitz. The war never slept. It merely shifted targets. At 0300 hours, the call came. Briefing at 0400, takeoff at 0600. Torrance roused his crew from restless sleep, watching them transform from boys dreaming of home into the hardened professionals who would fight their way across Germany. They ate breakfast in silence, the condemned man's meal of powdered eggs and burnt toast washed down with coffee strong enough to strip paint. Then came the ritual of dressing, layering on electrically heated suits, fleece-lined leather jackets, Mae West life preservers, parachute harnesses, oxygen masks, throat microphones. By the time a crew was fully dressed, they resembled spacemen more than soldiers, bulky and awkward, barely able to move. The ride to the flight line came in open trucks, rows of silent men jostling against each other as vehicles bounced over rutted roads. Dawn broke slowly, a reluctant gray light seeping across the horizon. Torrance could see them now, hundreds of B-17s parked in neat rows, each one a cathedral of aluminum and hope. Ground crews performed final checks, fuel trucks topped off tanks, bomb carts delivered their deadly cargo. The bombers seemed to crouch on the tarmac, predators waiting to be unleashed. Wrath of Angels sat at her hardstand, scarred and battered but ready. Torrance ran his hand along the fuselage, feeling the patches where flak had torn through, remembering missions where they had limped home on 2 engines with half the crew wounded. She was an ugly bird, but she was theirs. The crew performed their walk-around inspection with ritualistic precision. Holloway checked navigation equipment. Kowalski tested his turret rotation. The waist gunners Corporal James Sullivan and Private First Class Raymond Chen loaded ammunition belts and checked oxygen connections. Technical Sergeant Harold Barnes, the flight engineer and top turret gunner, climbed through the aircraft's interior, verifying every system. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, the radio operator, tuned his equipment and verified frequencies. In the tail, isolated and alone, Sergeant Thomas Burke settled into his position, testing his twin .50 calibers, the last line of defense against fighters attacking from behind. At 05:45, green flares arced into the sky. Start engines. 4 Wright Cyclone radials coughed, sputtered, then roared to life, propellers transforming from static metal into invisible discs of lethal force. The sound was overwhelming, a physical presence that shook the ground and rattled teeth. Torrance ran through his checklist with Barnes calling out responses, every switch and gauge verified, every system checked and rechecked. In the right seat, his co-pilot, Lieutenant Gregory Fisher, monitored engine temperatures and fuel flow. Fisher was on his 3rd mission, still green but learning fast. Torrance had seen too many co-pilots freeze when things went wrong. He prayed Fisher was not one of them. The tower's voice crackled through headsets. Aircraft commander, you are cleared for taxi. Torrance released brakes and nudged throttles forward. Wrath of Angels lurched into motion, following the B-17 ahead, part of a long procession rolling toward the active runway. All around them, the armada stirred to life. Hundreds of bombers began their ponderous dance, moving into position, forming up for takeoff. The choreography was complex, precise, and unforgiving. One mistake, one aircraft straying from its slot, and the entire formation could collapse into chaos. At 0600 exactly, the lead aircraft thundered down the runway, engine screaming, heavy with fuel and bombs, clawing for altitude. Every 30 seconds, another followed, until the sky filled with the thunder of 4,000 engines. Torrance waited his turn, watching bombers ahead lift off, some gracefully, some wallowing into the air like pregnant whales. Then it was their moment. He pushed throttles to the stops, felt Wrath of Angels shudder and surge. Solary. Accelerating down concrete scarred by years of heavy use, 60 miles per hour, 80, 100. The tail lifted. Fisher called out airspeeds. 120, 130. Torrance eased back on the yoke and they were airborne, climbing into the gray dawn, leaving England behind, heading toward Germany and whatever hell waited there. The assembly took over an hour, bombers climbing in wide circles, finding their formations, stacking into groups and wings and divisions. Torrance slotted Wrath of Angels into her position, tucked in tight with the other aircraft of the 351st Bomb Group. Around them the sky filled with flying fortresses, hundreds of them, a sight that never failed to inspire awe. This was American industrial might made manifest, the arsenal of democracy turned into flying steel. Each bomber represented tens of thousands of man-hours, millions of dollars, and the lives of 10 men who had volunteered to ride them into the teeth of the enemy. Together they formed a sword aimed at the heart of Hitler's war machine. As they climbed through 10,000 feet, Torrance ordered oxygen masks on. The air grew thin, bitter cold, deadly without supplemental oxygen. Ice formed on windscreens. Gunners in exposed positions stamped their feet and flexed fingers, fighting the numbing cold that could freeze flesh in seconds. At 20,000 feet the temperature plunged to 40 below zero. At 25,000 their operational altitude it was colder than the Arctic, colder than the surface of Mars. Men endured because they had no choice. The alternative was to descend into range of lighter flak, and that was suicide. The English Channel passed beneath them, gray water flecked with whitecaps, then the enemy coast, a line of sand and concrete fortifications where German radar operators watched the massive formation approach and reached for telephones. Within minutes, Luftwaffe bases across northern Germany erupted into frantic activity. Fighter pilots sprinted to their aircraft, ground crews armed cannons and machine guns. Engines fired, and the hunters prepared to meet the hunted. Or so they thought. What the Germans did not know, what their intelligence had failed to grasp, was that this was not another raid. This was the beginning of their destruction. Over the next 7 days this formation would return again and again, each time in greater strength, each time cutting deeper. And accompanying them for the first time in sufficient numbers and with sufficient range would come the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, the long-range escort fighters that would turn the hunters into prey. Big Week had begun, and the Luftwaffe was about to discover that the skies they had ruled for years were no longer theirs. Torrance checked his watch, 1 hour to the target, 1 hour before the killing started. He glanced at Fisher, saw the younger man's knuckles white on the controls. In the back, his crew maintained their positions, scanning the sky for the first sign of enemy fighters. They did not have to wait long. At the IP, the initial point where the bomb run began, the first German fighters appeared, black dots on the horizon that grew with terrifying speed into sleek predators bristling with cannons. The Luftwaffe had arrived, and they were furious. But this time something was different. This time, mixed among the bombers flying escort with a range that had previously been impossible, came the Mustangs. Silver streaks of American engineering tore into the German formations with savage efficiency. The Luftwaffe had expected another turkey shoot. Instead, they found themselves in a knife fight with opponents who could match them turn for turn, dive for dive, and who outnumbered them for the first time in the war. The sky over Germany erupted into a maelstrom of fire and fury, and for the first time the Germans realized they were not hunting. They were dying. Torrance held Wrath of Angels steady in formation as chaos exploded around him. A Focke-Wulf flashed past so close he could see the pilot's face, and then it was gone. A P-51 locked onto its tail, guns blazing. Tracers arced through the air like malevolent fireflies. Aircraft, both Allied and German, tumbled from the sky trailing smoke and flame. The bomber to their right shuddered as cannon shells walked across its wing, tearing aluminum like paper. The wing folded, snapped, and the bomber entered its final spin, men tumbling from the wreckage, parachutes blossoming too slowly. Kowalski's voice came over the intercom, calm despite the horror. Bandit, 6 o'clock low. Burke's tail guns hammered, spent casings raining into the fuselage. The Bandit broke off, trailing smoke, but whether it was destroyed or merely damaged, no one could say. The flak started at the IP, black puffs of explosive force that shook the bombers like toys. Torrance flew through it because there was no alternative. Evasive action would break formation, and a lone bomber was a dead bomber. So they flew straight and level, enduring, while shrapnel pinged against aluminum, and men prayed to gods they had forgotten since childhood. The bombardier, Lieutenant Paul Donnelly, hunched over his Norden bombsight, making minute adjustments, tracking the target as it crawled beneath them. Bomb bay doors open, the aircraft lurched as drag increased, flak intensified, the Germans knowing that open bomb bays made planes vulnerable, and still Donnelly worked, calm and precise, ignoring the chaos, focused solely on his task. Bombs away. Wrath of Angels leaped upward, suddenly thousands of pounds lighter. Torrance fought to maintain formation as the aircraft tried to climb. Behind and below, 500 tons of high explosives plummeted toward Tudo, toward the factory that built fighters, toward the rail yards and storage facilities and assembly halls. The bombs fell in a carefully calculated pattern designed to walk across the target, overlapping explosions that would crush buildings and ignite fuel stores and bury machinery under tons of rubble. For 30 seconds the world below ceased to exist, replaced by a rolling carpet of fire and destruction. Then came the turn. The agonizing minutes when the formation wheeled away from the target, still under flak, still vulnerable, heading for home. Torrance scanned his instruments, all engines running, fuel sufficient, no major damage. They had been lucky, others had not. He counted the bombers around him, comparing to the number that had crossed the coast. 6 were missing from their group alone, 60 men. Some might have bailed out over occupied territory, facing imprisonment, or worse, others were simply gone. atomized in mid-air explosions or consumed by fire. War reduced men to statistics, but Torrance knew each missing aircraft represented stories never finished, letters that would arrive in small American towns bearing unbearable news. The flight home stretched interminably. Fuel burned, fighters departed for their bases, and the bombers droned westward, gradually descending from the killing heights. Some limped on damaged engines, others trailed smoke or flew with gaping holes in fuselages, but they flew, stubbornly refusing to fall, because falling meant death or captivity, and they had not come this far to surrender now. The English coast appeared, a line of welcome green after hours over enemy territory. Fields and villages materialized, peaceful and untouched, a reminder of what they fought to preserve. Landing was controlled chaos, damaged aircraft given priority, crash crews standing ready with foam and ambulances. Torrance brought Wrath of Angels down smoothly, tires squealing on concrete, engines throttling back. They taxied to their hard stand and shut down. For a moment nobody moved. They sat in silence, surrounded by the ticking of cooling metal, breathing air that smelled of oil and cordite and sweat. Then Barnes popped the top hatch and cold English air flooded in, and they remembered they were alive. The debriefing took hours. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. What did you see? How many fighters? What types? Where was flak heaviest? Did bombs hit the target? The questions blurred together. Torrance answered mechanically, his mind already moving to tomorrow when they would climb back into Wrath of Angels and do it all again, because that was the plan. 7 days, 7 missions. Big Week was not a single raid, but a sustained campaign, a hammer blow that would not stop until the Luftwaffe was broken, or the 8th Air Force was destroyed trying. That night, word spread through the base. The mission had been a success. Tudo was devastated. Reconnaissance photos showed assembly halls collapsed, rail yards torn apart, fires still burning hours after the raid, but the cost had been severe. 18 bombers from their wing had not returned, 180 men, and this was only day 1. 6 more days remained, 6 more missions into the teeth of German defenses. The mathematics were brutal. If losses continued at this rate, half the 8th Air Force would be gone by week's end. But something else emerged from the debriefing reports, something that sent ripples of excitement through intelligence circles. The Mustangs had performed beyond expectations. German fighters had been shot down in unprecedented numbers. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots had been forced to fight defensively, breaking off attacks to deal with American escorts. The dynamic was shifting, the predator was becoming prey, and tomorrow, when the Armada rose again, there would be even more Mustangs, even more Thunderbolts, hunting the hunters across German skies. In his bunk that night, Torrance lay awake listening to the sounds of the barracks, snores and muttered dreams, the occasional cry from someone reliving the day's horror. He thought about the men who would not return, about empty bunks and belongings packed into boxes. He thought about tomorrow, and the day after and the day after that. 6 more times into hell, 6 more chances to die, but also 6 more chances to strike the blow that would win the war, that would make D-Day possible, that would bring them all home. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that in a few hours it would begin again. February 21st dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of weather bomber crews both prayed for and dreaded. Clear skies meant accurate bombing but also exposed formations to every fighter and flak gun in Germany. Torrance climbed back into Wrath of Angels with muscles that ached from yesterday's tension, joining a formation even larger than the first. Over 900 bombers this time, targeting factories in Brunswick and beyond. The Luftwaffe High Command had spent the night frantically reorganizing, pulling fighters from training schools and operational units across occupied Europe. They understood now that this was not another isolated raid. The Americans intended to destroy them. The second mission proved even more vicious than the first. German fighter pilots, stung by their losses, attacked with desperate fury. Major Wilhelm Hartmann, a veteran ace with 43 kills, led his Jagdgeschwader into the bomber stream with the ferocity of a man defending his homeland against invaders. He was not wrong. These American bombers were not simply attacking military targets, they were dismantling the very machinery that kept the Luftwaffe airborne. Every factory destroyed meant fewer replacement aircraft. Every assembly hall reduced to rubble meant his comrades would fly obsolete machines against an enemy whose production never ceased. Hartmann understood the mathematics. Germany was being outbuilt, outproduced, overwhelmed by industrial capacity that dwarfed anything the Reich could muster. He selected his target, a B-17 slightly out of formation, perhaps damaged by flak or struggling with an engine failure. Hartmann dove from above, cannons hammering, watching his rounds stitch across the bomber's wing. fuel sprayed, ignited, and the fortress began its death spiral. But before he could celebrate, tracers flashed past his canopy. A Mustang had locked onto him, flown by Captain James Kincaid, a farm boy from Iowa who had logged 200 hours in fighters and possessed reflexes honed by youth and desperation. The roles reversed in an instant. Hartmann twisted through the sky, trying every trick accumulated over years of combat. The Mustang stayed with him, turn for turn, matching his every maneuver. Hartmann's wingman called a warning too late. Kincaid's guns found their mark. The Focke-Wulf shuddered, smoke pouring from the engine. Hartmann wrestled with the controls, felt them go slack as hydraulics failed, and pulled the canopy release. The slipstream tore him from the cockpit, parachute deploying, watching his aircraft cartwheel into the ground below. He dangled beneath silk, descending toward his own country, now littered with the wreckage of the Luftwaffe he had served. For Torrance and his crew, the second day brought a new horror. Flying through the flak barrage over Brunswick, shrapnel tore through their No. 3 engine. Oil pressure dropped to zero, cylinder head temperature spiked into the red, and Torrance feathered the propeller before it could tear itself apart. Wrath of Angels shuddered, losing altitude, falling behind the formation. Fisher's face went pale. Stragglers were prime targets, isolated bombers that fighters could attack without interference from defensive crossfire. Barnes worked frantically, trying to coax more power from the remaining engines, but physics was merciless. They were losing altitude at 200 feet per minute, and the rest of the formation was pulling ahead. Kowalski's voice crackled over the intercom. 4 bandits, 3 hawk high. The Messerschmitts had spotted them, wolves separating wounded prey from the herd. Torrance called for maximum power on the remaining engines, feeling them strain, temperatures climbing toward dangerous levels. If they pushed too hard, another engine would fail. If they did not, the fighters would tear them apart. The choice was binary and immediate, push or die. He pushed. The German fighters dove, cannons winking, but suddenly they scattered as a flight of thunderbolts roared through. P-47s flown by pilots who had been hunting for exactly this scenario. Lieutenant Marcus Webb transmitted their gratitude on the radio, his voice shaking with relief. The thunderbolts circled Wrath of Angels like protective angels, shepherding them toward the coast, keeping the Luftwaffe at bay. They made it back to England on 3 engines, landing with fuel tanks nearly dry, the bomber groaning as it settled onto the runway. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft, already assessing damage, calculating repair time. Torrance knew they would work through the night, because tomorrow there would be another mission, and the day after, and the day after that. This was the rhythm of Big Week. Fly, fight, repair, repeat. The attrition was staggering on both sides, but the mathematics favored the Americans. For every B-17 lost, factories in Seattle and Long Beach and Wichita were building 3 more. For every German fighter destroyed, the Luftwaffe struggled to replace it with dwindling resources and shrinking industrial capacity. By the 4th day, the German fighter force was bleeding catastrophically. Pilots, who had survived years of combat, fell to American escorts in battles that raged across hundreds of miles. Training schools were emptied, sending teenagers with 50 hours of flight time against American veterans. The results were massacre. On February 24, Luftwaffe losses exceeded 100 aircraft in a single day. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable men who had learned their craft over years, vanished in seconds. Major Hartmann, recovered from his bailout, returned to his squadron to find half his comrades gone, replaced by boys who barely knew how to form up, let alone fight. The German High Command watched their air force disintegrate and understood the terrible truth. They could not win a war of attrition against American production. Every factory raid succeeded despite their best efforts. Brunswick, Regensburg, Augsburg, Schweinfurt, targets struck with methodical precision, each one another wound in the Luftwaffe's ability to regenerate. Göring raged, demanding his pilots do more, fight harder, die more gloriously. But rage could not manufacture aircraft or train pilots or reverse the fundamental imbalance in industrial might. Torrance flew every mission, watching the sky gradually shift from German domain to contested airspace to American hunting ground. By the 6th day, Luftwaffe resistance had become sporadic, desperate. Fighters attacked in 1s and 2s rather than coordinated formations. Many simply refused to engage, diving away when escorts appeared, preserving themselves for battles they might survive. The psychological shift was profound. For years German pilots had been the hunters, now they were prey, and they knew it. The swagger was gone, replaced by grim determination mixed with despair. On February 25, the final day, Torrance led his crew on their seventh mission in as many days. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, but the target was Regensburg, home to Messerschmitt production facilities. The strike force numbered over 1,000 bombers, the largest assembly yet, and the escort fighters outnumbered the remaining Luftwaffe defenders by overwhelming margins. The mission was almost routine, flak predictable, fighters absent. They dropped their bombs, watched Regensburg's factories collapse into rubble, and turned for home without significant opposition. It felt anticlimactic after the fury of previous days, but that was precisely the point. The Luftwaffe was finished as an effective fighting force. The week ended with numbers that spoke louder than propaganda. The Americans had lost 226 bombers, over 2,000 men. The losses were severe, painful, each one a tragedy, but the Luftwaffe had been annihilated. Conservative estimates placed German fighter losses above 600 aircraft, with many more damaged beyond repair. More critically, over 400 pilots were dead or captured, men whose experience could never be replaced. Training took years. The Germans no longer had years. Production facilities lay in ruins, assembly lines silent, supply chains severed. The Luftwaffe would continue to exist on paper, but its spine was broken. When the final mission returned, and Torrance shut down Wrath of Angels for the last time that week, the ground crew chief approached with a weary smile. 7 missions, 7 days, and you brought her home every time. Torrance looked at the battered bomber, patched and repaired so many times she was more scar tissue than original aluminum. She had carried them through hell and delivered them back to England despite everything the Germans threw at them, but she was just metal and rivets. The real miracle was the men, the crews who climbed back into those aircraft day after day, knowing the odds, knowing that each mission might be their last. Intelligence reports began filtering through within days. Luftwaffe sortie rates had collapsed. Fighter production would take months to recover, and by then the invasion would have succeeded or failed based on the air superiority Big Week had secured. German generals looked at the wreckage of their air force and understood that Overlord, the invasion they had prepared for, would happen under American skies. Their ability to contest the beaches was crippled. The road to Berlin lay open not because of a single brilliant strategy, but because of brutal arithmetic. The Allies could replace losses. Germany could not. Torrance received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions during Big Week, along with most of his crew. The medals felt heavy, not with pride, but with memory. They represented men who had not come home, empty chairs in mess halls, letters written to families who would never fully understand what their sons and husbands had endured. Victory was not clean or glorious. It was bloody and brutal and purchased with lives measured in hundreds, but it was victory nonetheless. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe for years had been bled white in 7 days of relentless combat. Historians would debate Big Week for decades. Some called it the turning point of the air war, others argued it was simply one campaign among many, but the men who flew it knew the truth. Those 7 days in February 1944 broke something fundamental in the German war machine. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility shattered against American industrial might, and the courage of crews who climbed into their bombers knowing they might not return. When D-Day came 4 months later, Allied aircraft ruled the skies above Normandy. German fighters appeared sporadically, shadows of the force that once dominated European airspace. The invasion succeeded in part because of those 7 days when 1,000 B-17s 7th Air escorts systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's ability to fight back. Torrance flew 35 missions before his tour ended. He returned to Oklahoma, married his sweetheart, raised children who never fully understood why their father sometimes woke screaming in the night. He carried Big Week with him for the rest of his life, the memory of burning aircraft and falling men, of flak bursting so close he could smell the cordite, of engines failing, and fighters attacking, and the constant, grinding terror of knowing that death rode with him at 25,000 feet. But he also carried something else, the knowledge that what they did mattered, that those 7 days in February shortened the war, saved lives, and helped deliver the world from tyranny. The cost was terrible, but the alternative was worse. That was the bargain of Big Week, and every man who flew it understood the price. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.